All right, so we are going to take a look at some overview concepts of bone tissue or skeletal tissue, and that's going to lead us into our axial and appendicular skeletons, which is what we'll be focusing on for a little over a month for a good chunk of the rest of our semester. So the skeletal system itself not only contains skeleton, so bones, but it also has cartilage, ligaments, as well as a variety of other tissues that are involved in the functionality or physiology of the skeletal system. You can see a list of the primary functions, support and protection being two key pieces. Support allows for movement to take place, as does the connection between muscles and bones, which provides leverage, and those are going to occur at joints. Protection, though, is important, especially for soft tissue, for nervous tissue like our brain and our spinal cord, as well as some of the other important organs like in our thoracic cavity, heart, lungs, etc. But the bone also stores several different types of minerals, so calcium and phosphorus in particular, and fat. Yellow bone marrow stores fat, which again is an energy source. And then hematopoiesis, or red blood cell formation, takes place within bones as well, and that is another key function of the skeletal system. There are various types of bones, so as we begin to study the different bones and you learn them, we will be taking a look at the various types of shapes. So you can see the 6 categories, and I'm actually going to skip to the visual page. And you can see that there are a variety pack. I would say long, short, flat, and irregular are kind of your 4 main categories, with sutural and sesamoid bones being kind of your oddballs. So let's take a look at the 2 oddballs first, and then I'll go through the other 4. So sutural bones are basically smaller bones of the skull that usually form around the sutures or the joints that connect the various types of skull bones together. And they basically kind of fill in some of the gaps where the sutures don't completely connect. Sometimes they're really good puzzle pieces, and sometimes they're missing a tiny piece or 2. You're not going to be required to learn any specific sutural bones. You will be learning the large flat bones of the skull, though, which we'll talk about in our next unit. Sesamoid bones are bones that actually develop within usually some type of joint. So the most prominent sesamoid bone that you have is the patella, or your kneecap. But you do have a few of them at some other locations, especially in your hands or in your feet. But the only sesamoid bone that we would have you identify is the patella, right? All right, so for our 4 main groups, let's start with flat bones. They are thin. They typically have parallel surfaces, so you can see that kind of sectional cross-section view of the parietal bone. We see flat bones located in the skull, so a lot of our skull bones that interconnect to form what we refer to as the skull are flat, and then your ribs as well as your scapula. And again, that has to do with the way the tissue grows to make it flat. Short bones are just exactly what they say. They're short, so they're kind of box-like in terms of their height and their width are sort of similar. And most of the short bones in your body are contained in your wrist. So those are called carpal bones, or in your ankle, which are called tarsal bones. You also have long bones, and long bones are kind of typically what you would expect to see with a bone. Your humerus, your radius, your ulna, and then your femur, your tibia, and your fibula. So the long bones of your appendages. You also have long bones that are your metacarpals, so the longer bones of your palm, your metatarsals, the longer bones of your feet. So you've got several different types of long bones, and they're the kind of typical generic bone that we'll be looking at in this brief overview. And then lastly are irregular bones, and they basically it's pretty much everybody else. So all your vertebra, your pelvic bones, so your coxal bones of the hip, and then some of the bones in your, especially facial bones in your skull, are also going to be irregular. And basically they have very complex, odd type shapes, hence the name irregular. The next several slides go into detail of each of those categories, so please feel free to read through and look at those examples as you go. The next section of Chapter 6 talks about bone markings, and there are 2 primary categories of bone markings, projections or openings and depressions. I highly recommend that you go through this, especially those of you PT focuses or any kind of medical doctor, nurse, etc. You will need to know these markings. We may not cover all of them when we do our axial and appendicular skeletons, but I would like you to be aware of what their purpose is. If it is a marking that's a projection, that's basically where you have some type of attachment point. So a muscle, a tendon, a ligament, something attaches to that spot and allows for articulation or joints. Or you have a type of marking that essentially is an opening or a depression. And basically that allows for the passage of any type of vessels, so lymphatic or blood, or potentially nerves. And the next few slides go in the different categories of those. So the projections are listed there, a process or a ramus. Openings are listed there, a sinus, a foramen, a fissure, a meatus, a canal. You have depressions that are there, so a sulcus and a fossa. And then you have those other types of projections for attachment and protections for joints. So trochanters, crest, spine, line, tubercle, tuberosity, head, neck, facet, condyle, and trochlea. And so as we head into appendicular and axial skeleton and focus on those, we will look at some of those particular markings as we go. But the main purpose of doing this little overview week is to focus on the structure of a long bone. So basically, what are the parts of a bone? And so we're going to take a look at some of those generic, general ones here. I'm actually going to do that on the picture, and you can flip through the slides if you wish. There are two primary parts of a long bone. So the first, the shaft of the bone is called the diaphysis. So that's that center portion. And then you have two epiphyses. All right, this is the, in this case, because this is the femur, this is the proximal epiphyses. Remember, proximal means attaching to the trunk. And then this is the distal epiphyses, located further away from that attachment point. Notice that within the long bone, you're going to have two types of bone tissue. You will have compact bone, which we'll look at the structure of that later, and spongy bone. And you can already see a difference between those two. And we will take a look at that when we look at the long bones in class. You also have a cavity that opens up in this section called the medullary cavity. And within that, you are going to have some vascularization, some nerves, as well as yellow bone marrow. Some of the more intricate characteristics of bone tissue are going to involve various types of wrappings. You have periosteum and endosteum, which we'll look at, and then you have passageways, and they are called canaliculi, which is what you see there in those two color-coded vocab words. The next kind of few slides go over some of the aspects of what makes up bone tissue. So this bone matrix slide talks about the types of minerals that are located in bone. I would assume everybody knows, calcium is one of your primary minerals. That's why we need to drink milk when we're young, because we need calcium for our bones, as well as phosphates. Those two primary minerals are what are going to make up our bone tissue and provide it to be healthy versus, as you can see in the picture, unhealthy bone tissue that is very soft and flexible. You also have different types of cells that make up bone tissue, and you can see that they all begin with the prefix osteo. Osteo refers to bone or osseous tissue. So anytime you see that, that is going to indicate that process. We're not going to get into bone tissue development, but it's good practice to know that a blast builds and a clast cleans up. Anything that's called a site is a mature cell. And anything with genic in it is a stem cell, something that is growing. So not the worst idea to know those kind of general terms. So genic refers to stem cell. Blast builds tissue, A site is a mature cell, and then a clast cleans up. So when we look at the two types of bone tissue, compact and spongy bone, we have two different types of structures. So in a compact bone, the functional structural unit is called an osteon. And within that osteon, it's going to have some canals and it's going to have some layers, and those are called lamellae. So let's take a look. That is a microscopic image. So you can see they kind of look like tree trunks. That's how I remember compact bone. Compact bone looks like tree trunks. Spongy bone looks like silly string has been sprayed or cobwebs. So if we take a look at a diagram, this is one of the things you need to label. So let's take a look at some of that bone tissue, compact bone anatomy. You can see an individual osteon here. So it's that whole tree trunk, and here's another whole tree trunk. You can see that within those tree trunks, you are going to have these perforating fibers that are going to run. You can see them here as well. They're going to run through each of those osteons. You can see the central canal, so essentially the center of the tree trunk, and you can see it here zoomed out, is where you are going to have your vascularization. So that's why when you break a bone, it bleeds, because it's living tissue. Sometimes hard to think about when it's bone, but it's living tissue, and so it needs nutrients, and that's why we have vascularization there. And then you can see off the central canal, you have what are called perforating canals. So you basically are going to have a main or central canal, and then a perforating or a side canal that branches off, that works through the various osteons that are in the bone tissue. What you can also see is that we have those tree rings, and what we end up with each ring on the tree is called lamellae, and that's kind of a layer upon a layer, almost like an onion, right? Where you have that layer and then another and another. That is what your bone tissue for compact bone is going to look like. You are going to have those tree rings, those lamellae that are going to make their way around that central canal. What you'll notice about the fibers that make up those lamellae is that they are oriented in opposite directions. So you can see on the top and the bottom layer or tree ring, if you will, that are pulled out. You can see that they are going in the same direction, and then the middle layer is going in the opposite. And basically, why collagen fibers within compact bone are oriented that way is to add strength and resistance, to provide strength to that bone tissue, is that we're kind of weaving or plaiting, braiding through those collagen fibers to give that bone some strength and resistance as well. Some of the other, or the other type of bone tissue that we will look at is called spongy bone. And spongy bone does not have those tree trunks. It doesn't have osteons. It has trabeculae, or basically this kind of spider web formation. And the reason being is that it is producing red bone marrow in that. And basically what happens in red bone marrow is the production of RBCs, or red blood cells. And that process is called hematopoiesis. In other areas, you may also have yellow bone marrow. And yellow bone marrow basically is fat. It's a fat storage substance. And so here we can see at the proximal epiphysis of this femur, you can see the spongy bone. All right, it's much more web-like. Here's our diagram version. It's much more web-like, wholly, if you will. And again, kind of interconnected. Still has the lamellae, just within that trabeculae. So within the kind of silly string or spider web format, you still do have the layers that are located there. They're just not in osteon form, so in that tree trunk form. And so those are our two primary types of bone tissue. And the reason being is that we want to have strength and resistance with our compact bone, but we also want to have weight bearing. And trabeculae, surprisingly, provides a large amount of weight-bearing abilities. And basically, it allows for a transfer of our weight, of our energy, kind of down and through the bone so that we can transmit that through the other weight-bearing bones down back to the ground, so that we are not competing with gravity too much. I mentioned earlier that there are going to be a couple of coverings that are going to go on the bones as well. So there's two membranes that we would like you to be aware of. One is the periosteum. Periosteum is like saran wrap that goes on the outside of the bone, and that will be continuous with any type of attachment, so a ligament or a tendon that would be attaching to a bone. You'll notice in the periosteum here that you have some vascularization that is located near and dear to that, as well as nerve tissue, okay? And then you have an inner layer, an inner wallpaper, and that's called the endosteum. So in the medullary cavity here within our long bone, it is going to have endosteum. Here's our endosteum layer as well. And again, that's going to allow for growth and repair and provide, again, a lining for the internal cavities within our long bones. Right? Lastly, in this overview section is I just want to mention the concept of a fracture. Fracture means break. So when a bone breaks, we call that a fracture. And that fracture could be complete or incomplete. It could be open or closed. Open means that it has broken the skin. So closed means it did not. Complete means it totally snapped in half, like if you took a pencil and totally broke it in two pieces. And incomplete means you didn't do that. So you broke it, but not entirely. So, all right, so a little bit gross there. Let's take a quick view. You can see that there are other terms we use. Some of these you may be familiar with because you may have had one of these fractures. Here is kind of an overview of the various types of fractures that happen. I'm going to mention just one or two of these. An epiphyseal fracture, so on one of your epiphyseal plates, that is a typical fracture in children, and that is because kids are still growing in that area, and so it is a potential for a weak spot because you have active tissue growth in that location. Sometimes we refer to epiphyseal plates as growth plates. Eventually, those growth plates will stop growing and stop actively dividing as we reach adulthood and the hormones stop being sent there. But when you are young, that's a pretty typical fracture. Displaced fractures are typical too, not typical, but are another common type of fracture. Here you can see that instead of saying in alignment, which would be non-displaced, basically what's happened is the bone has fractured in two locations and this lower portion has become displaced out of alignment. And then we have another type of fracture that's called a compression. So again, this could be kind of a crushing fracture that could occur for a variety pack of reasons, but we often see compression fractures in the spine. You can take a look at the other types of fractures you can look through. We'll talk about a few in class as well. But they're definitely interesting. I'll put up some pictures of some of the fractures that I have x-rays of. And you, can feel free to share your stories as well. All right, that's our overview of bone tissue to prep us for axial and appendicular skeleton.